Wounded Knee, 1973. Prequel: The 1960s were a troubled time in U.S. history. The war in Vietnam and the civil rights movement marked the decade, along with great music. In the midst of all the social happenings, the American Indian movement originated in 1968, arising from the concerns of Native Americans in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Shortly, the movement focused on changing the life of Native Americans in the urban environment, addressing poverty, lack of political representation, discrimination, and police brutality. Members coordinated a neighborhood patrol to circumvent unjust arrests and police mishandling of Native residents. Clyde Bellicourt and Dennis Banks, Chippewa from Minnesota, assisted in the creation of AIM. Later, Russell Means, an Oglala Sioux, became one of the more aggressive leaders of the organization. The AIM members sponsored the Trail of Broken Treaties in 1972. Approximately 900 people traveling from Seattle and San Francisco stopped at reservations throughout the West to point out Native grievances toward the U.S. government. The trail ended in Washington, D.C., with the takeover of the Bureau of Indian Affairs building from November 2 through November 8, 1972. Negotiations between the White House administrators and AIM members resulted in an agreement that included a pledge to deal with economic, social, and educational injustice of Native Americans and to provide return travel money. Following the death of Raymond Yellow Thunder in February of 1972 in Gordon, Nebraska, the AIM took over Gordon Community Hall. Leaders declared a victory after local officials proposed the establishment of a Human Relations Board to investigate grievances. Just 1 month before the Wounded Knee siege in Buffalo Gap, South Dakota, Harold Schmidt killed Wesley Badhart Bowe. Prosecutors charged Schmidt with involuntary manslaughter. In Custer, South Dakota, AIM members protested and the courthouse and Chamber of Commerce burned to the ground. After that, the U.S. government viewed the AIM as a militant group and increased surveillance of its activities. On the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, Oglala Sioux leaders requested the assistance of AIM in order to provide strength in their opposition to tribal President Richard Wilson. Elected in 1972, opponents of Wilson accused him of mishandling tribal funds, misusing authority, and disregarding rules of the Tribal Council. After a failed impeachment, the U.S. Department of Justice sent out 50 U.S. Marshals to the Pine Ridge Reservation to be available in the case of a civil disturbance. The takeover begins. On February 27, 1973, about 200 AIM members came to the village of Wounded Knee and took over the trading post, museum, gas station, and several churches. Those involved in the takeover considered Wounded Knee of historical significance because of the 1890 massacre that occurred at the spot. In 1890, the U.S. Army killed 250 to 300 Lakota Sioux, with 25 Army casualties. The goals set by AIM leaders were support for the reformation of tribal government, as well as bringing attention to the injustices done to Native American people. Russell Means, as an AIM spokesperson, requested congressional investigations into conditions on all reservations and the corruption of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Means specifically wanted a hearing to take place concerning treaties and treaty rights. News of the takeover reached U.S. Marshals at Pine Ridge, and they placed roadblocks at all entrances to Wounded Knee to prevent access to the area. U.S. Marshals and FBI agents set a total of 6 roadblocks, along with 5 observation points, throughout the occupation to keep people from entering or leaving Wounded Knee. However, AIM and supporters entered the area by overland routes, bringing in supplies. Law enforcement groups consisted of the U.S. Marshals Service, the FBI, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Start of the troubles after the takeover, sporadic gunfire between U.S. forces and the AIM marked the first days of the occupation. AIM forces fortified the area by building trenches, 9 bunkers setting up roadblocks, and establishing foot patrols. The natives also relied on combat experience from Vietnam veterans in their ranks. The aim stated that the occupation would end if requests were considered, and a meeting took place to discuss injustices done to Native Americans. Senators James Oberesk and George McGovern, alongside 2 aides from Senator Ted Kennedy's office, arrived on March 1. They agreed to congressional committee hearings and BIA officers to be transferred. Officials decided to continue roadblocks to limit entrance into the area. AIM leaders made a statement on March 4th, declaring they would leave Wounded Knee if the U.S. government left, and allowed the Lakota to work out the conflict amongst themselves. Ralph Erickson, Special Assistant to the Attorney General, countered this proposal by stating that if the occupiers would leave Wounded Knee by March 8, abandon weapons, and identify themselves, they would not be subject to immediate arrest. Richard Wilson organized a special police force that became known as the Goon Squad. Wilson and his forces participated in gunfire exchanges on several occasions. By March 8, both sides rejected negotiation. After that, the government removed the roadblocks, thinking the Lakota would disperse given the chance not to be arrested. Contrary to that, the AIM saw this as a victory, and more supporters entered Wounded Knee, bringing supplies and food. On March 11, postal inspectors entered the village to inspect postal property. The AIM took them hostage, thinking they were sent to gain information. After 4 hours, they were released, and the roadblocks were reinstalled. On the same day, the Lakota announced the creation of the independent Oglala Nation, or Ion. The Ion established a provisional government and stated the return to the Treaty of 1868 as its basis. Leaders stated that the Ion would negotiate with the United States, nation to nation. Their demands were now changes within the Bureau of Indian Affairs, meetings with government administrators, tribal President Richard Wilson, to be removed from office, suspension of the tribal constitution, a returned government as it existed under the Indian Reorganization Act, and negotiations based on the 1868 treaty. The day after, FBI agents pursued a van that attempted to enter the village. In the pursuit, a firefight broke out, and an FBI agent took a wound to the wrist. In order to assist the AIM and the Lakota, supporters created the Wounded Knee Legal Defense Offense Committee, and managed to negotiate that 6 lawyers, each with a carload of food, to enter Wounded Knee each day from March 26 through March 31. Law enforcement agreed to the deal, but Richard Wilson and his police set up the roadblocks and seized all food from the cars. Gunfire exchanges between forces occurred sporadically. Both sides established, violated, and reinstated ceasefires. AIM security, U.S. forces, and on occasion the tribal police exchanged fire. On March 26th, there was heavy firing after Wilson set up a roadblock outside the federal perimeter. During this exchange, U.S. Marshal Lloyd Grimm received a wound that paralyzed him from the waist down. By the end of April 2nd, deaths occurred. As a result of increased gunfire, Frank Clearwater and Lawrence Lamont died. Both forces established a ceasefire after that. After multiple failed negotiation attempts, leaders from the Civil Rights Division and 6 FBI agents met with AIM and Lakota leaders to discuss the misuse of tribal funds and complaints of harassment from Wilson's forces. Negotiations moved forward on April 5th. The U.S. government and AIM leaders signed a dispossession agreement. The terms of the agreement stated that Russell Means should submit himself for arrest and be taken into custody, and on April 7th, at 7 a.m., AIM leaders were to lay down their arms. A meeting would take place between AIM leaders and a representative of the White House to discuss the possibility of looking into the matter of Indian treaties. Means was arrested, and, after he made bond, left for Washington, D.C. The agreement proved faulty, as Means stated that the aim at Wounded Knee never agreed to lay down arms until the conclusion of a White House meeting. By April 24th, a negotiation team returned to Wounded Knee, led by Kent Frizzle. The U.S. government still preferred to negotiate with the AIM forces rather than resort to any aggressive attack. On May 5th, Leonard Garment, consultant to the president, sent a letter to Frank Fools Crow. The letter stated that White House representatives would meet with the Teton Sioux in order to examine the 1868 treaty. This meeting would not take place until the dispossession of Wounded Knee occurred. Both forces signed the dispossession agreement on May 5. The agreement contains specific steps to be implemented on May 9 at 7 a.m. All persons were to leave Wounded Knee and identify themselves, and those with outstanding warrants would be arrested. By May 8, half of the AIM community had left Wounded Knee. According to the timetable agreed upon, government forces entered Wounded Knee to collect all weapons and transport remaining AIM supporters to the government roadblock. Defense Committee lawyers remained at the government roadblock to witness the processing procedure. Out of the 129 people processed, 110 were Native Americans. Federal forces destroyed AIM security bunkers, along with government bunkers, and completed the evacuation of Wounded Knee by the end of the day. Several issues influenced the AIM decision to end the occupation, such as lack of food, electrical power, and medical supplies. The occupation had lasted 71 days. Aftermath on July 17th, a proposal for a Senate joint resolution in order to establish an Indian Policy Review Committee was made. Its purpose included a review of the legal relationship between Native Americans and the U.S. government, and to provide support for the development of more effective policy. During 1974, Russell Means lost a campaign against Richard Wilson for the tribal president at Pine Ridge. Means was concurrently on trial in St. Paul, Minnesota, on charges from the Wounded Knee incident. The trial lasted for over 8 months and resulted in the dismissal of all charges against both Means and Dennis Banks. In the 3 years following the standoff, Pine Ridge had the highest per capita murder rate in the country, resuming a quiet war. 2 FBI agents were among the dead. Today, the Pine Ridge Reservation is the largest community in what may be the poorest county in the entire United States.